Okay. All right. Well, good morning. We'll get started officially, and as others sign on, they can join us. As I started to say, it's very appropriate that we're having this event today because yesterday started Mental Illness Awareness Week. And not that we need a week to have to be aware of mental illness. It should be top of mind every day, but it is good to have a heightened focus on the topic. So, good morning and welcome to the Governor's Council of Mental Health Stigma's Media Roundtable. I'm Deborah Wentz, Chair of the Council. I also serve as President and CEO of the New Jersey Association of Mental Health and Addiction Agencies and Executive Director of the New Jersey Mental Health Institute. When Glenn Close, actress and co-founder of Bring Change to Mind, said, "What mental health needs is more sunlight, more candor, more unashamed conversation," she captured the spirit and mission of the Governor's Council on Mental Health Stigma, which was reactivated in January 2022 after a hiatus of several years. Never has there been a more necessary time for the council to reconvene and work to end stigma and discrimination and ensure health equity for all. We are stronger than ever and ready to forge ahead with our mission through today's event and many more to come, as well as a newly designed and updated website that will be launched in the near future. The council was established in November 2004 under an executive order issued by then acting Governor Richard Codey. Our goal is to combat stigma in order to create a better mental health system. With the proliferation of anxiety, depression, co-occurring, and other mental health disorders, as well as the persistence of stigma, despite the increasing awareness and prevalence of mental illnesses, our charge is critically important. I'm honored and grateful to be pursuing this mission with the members of the council who are Heidi Castrillon, President of the Hudson County Latin American Chamber of Commerce, Emily Grossman, Director of the Training Institute at Coordinated Behavioral Care, David Jacobs, President and owner of Old Time Syrups and Sundae Toppings, Reverend Jose Lopez, State Chaplain for the New Jersey Department of Corrections, Dr. Sam Madeley, CEO of United Pharmacy Network, Dr. Amy Spagnolo, Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions at Rutgers, the State University, Susan Talone, Clinical Director at the Society for the Prevention of Teen Suicide, and Dr. Janone Wilson, owner of Compass Counseling and Psychotherapy. It is critical to address the stigmatization of mental illness because it has resulted in the underdiagnosis and undertreatment of psychiatric illnesses. There has been and still is systemic discrimination of people with mental illness through lack of access to treatment and support services and lack of enforcement of parity in insurance coverage and payments. Meanwhile, the demand for mental health care has increased as all mental illnesses, not just depression and anxiety, have become more common, and pre-existing illnesses have become exacerbated due to COVID and the resulting isolation and economic issues, and due to natural disasters, climate change, and other difficult situations. While access to services and parity are in place, many people still do not seek clinical care or other support to work towards recovery because of stigma. It is the greatest barrier to treatment because people internalize the stigma, which makes them feel embarrassed or ashamed to have mental illness. Stigma from individuals who do not have mental illness is judgment of those who have it, stemming from a lack of understanding that mental illnesses are real, just like physical illnesses, and are not the result of any personal weakness or character flaw. Despite the greater awareness of mental illness, there's still a lack of education, and the media play a profound role in shaping the public's understanding and, in some cases, misunderstanding and opinions about mental illness, as it does on all issues. This roundtable is an important opportunity for journalists, broadcasters, and news directors and others to learn how to portray mental illnesses and individuals who have them in the most accurate and positive way possible. Public attitudes have already turned a corner, as demonstrated by the number of public figures who have opened up about their struggles. For example, performers, including the now deceased Robin Williams and Lady Gaga and Demi Lovato, and athletes Naomi Osaka, Michael Phelps, and Serena Williams. And there has been progress in news reporting. For example, according to an August 2022 article in The Guardian about mental health myths, the number of articles in English newspapers that stigmatized mental illness declined by nearly 50% from 2008 to 2016. During the same period, the number of articles that challenged stigma nearly doubled. The researchers also found that people subsequently reported experiencing a lot less stigma from friends, families, and colleagues compared to a few years prior. This article also shared that despite changing attitudes towards mental illnesses, there is still a huge amount of stigma about schizophrenia because people have a vague understanding of this particular illness and do not believe it is treatable. However, 45% of individuals with schizophrenia go into remission after 1 or 2 psychotic episodes and treatment. The media can be a powerful ally by educating people correctly about mental illnesses, or it can be a detractor by perpetuating myths, misinformation, and misperceptions. The power of words is undeniable, as is the power of the media. This is why today's roundtable is so important. Through the keynote presentation and panel discussion, we will focus on improving how the media reports on incidents involving people who have mental illness. We will also demonstrate the impact the media have from the perspectives of both media representatives and individuals with lived experience. Now it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote presenter, Dr. Otto Wall. I've had the privilege of working with Dr. Wall before. In my humble opinion, no one has come close to him in the important work of understanding stigma and educating the media and general public in order to prevent and eliminate it. I'm so pleased that Professor Emeritus at the University of Hartford, Dr. Wall, graciously agreed to deliver the keynote presentation, Improving Coverage of Mental Illness in the Media, and also agreed to moderate the panel discussion. Dr. Wall is the leading authority on stigma and media depiction of mental illnesses. He authored 2 insightful and impactful books, Media Madness, Public Images of Mental Illness, and Telling is Risky Business, Mental Health Consumers Confront Stigma. His extensive work also includes numerous research articles related to stigma and portrayals of mental illness in the media. Not surprisingly, Dr. Wall was selected to serve as an advisor to many organizations involved in public education about mental illnesses, including the National Stigma Clearinghouse and Mental Health America. I believe that should have been, I'm sorry, the National Self-Help Clearinghouse and Mental Health America. He has also been a member of the advisory board of the Carter Center Mental Health Journalism Fellowship Program and the Connecticut Legal Rights Project, as well as a board member for the Connecticut chapter of the National Alliance of Mental Illness and consultant for NAMI California and NAMI National. Also not surprising is the fact that Dr. Wall received numerous awards for his efforts to combat the stigma of mental illness, including the Patient Advocacy Award from the American Psychiatric Association, the Eli Lilly Welcome Back Award for Destigmatization, and the Thought Leader Award, which he received during the 7th Annual International Conference on Stigma. Clearly, Dr. Wall has a wealth of experience on this critical topic, and all of us will learn so much from him this morning. So without further ado, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Otto Wall.
Thank you, Deborah, for that very generous introduction, and thank you to everyone who is participating and showing interest in this important topic of how to improve media presentations about mental illness. I am here in Connecticut, where it is gray and cool today, but I am thankful that I am housed and dry and safe, unlike so many people in this country today. I will be talking, as Deborah has indicated, about stigma and about the media and about improving the way media cover mental illnesses. However, in doing so, I am not going to make you sit here and watch the lights reflect off my glasses, but will be providing my comments along with a PowerPoint, which you will see, which I will put on the screen, hopefully successfully. So if you would bear with me for just a moment while I do that. Okay. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Looks like on my screen it's covered a little bit by other things. Okay.
Dr. I see just a list of your files. Is that what everyone else is seeing? I'm not actually seeing the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Same. So double click on the highlighted title
The PowerPoint
of your file.
Is on my screen.
All right, try going back into the share screen, that green button.
Okay.
And there should be a picture of your PowerPoint screen. Make sure that's selected.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I have on my screen.
Oh, now I see it. Does everyone else see it now? I think we're good now.
It's fine.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're good, Shauna.
Good. Thank you very much. Let me start by reminding people that people with mental illnesses have a triple burden. They must first of all deal with conditions that are painful, distressing, and sometimes debilitating. And then they must deal with a mental health care system that is all too often underfunded, disorganized, and unresponsive to their needs. On top of all that, they must cope with the unfavorable attitudes and behaviors of others toward people with mental illnesses, what Deborah has referred to and what is known in the field as stigma. Of course, stigma has many, many different sources. And in this presentation, I do not mean to suggest that print or other media are the only contributors. However, we do know that media are important influencers, and they are important sources of information about a wide variety of topics. And studies have shown us when we ask people, where do you get your information about mental illnesses? mass media are often the main source cited for information about mental illnesses. So it's important to consider the ways that those media might contribute to stigma and to its reduction. I should note, first of all, though, that journalists have made many contributions already to improved care and understanding of mental illnesses. For example, there is the work of Elizabeth Cochran, better known as Nellie Bly, who in the late 1880s, early in her career, went undercover in the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell Island, New York, and wrote an expose, which was a newspaper article and later became a book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, which exposed the poor treatment of women there and led to a number of very important reforms in care. More recently, there is Clifford Levy's Pulitzer Prize-winning expose of abuses of people with mental illnesses in nursing homes in New York and New Jersey. These abuses included sending many people with psychiatric diagnoses for unnecessary surgeries in order to enhance profits. Or the 2006 Pulitzer Prize-winning series in the Portland Oregonian about substandard conditions at Oregon State Hospital, which, by the way, is the hospital where the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was done. There was a team of reporters. Their coverage included the discovery of more than 5,000 cremains of former and forgotten patients in rusting paint cans in what is now known as the Room of Forgotten Souls. The project is still underway to identify and provide proper burial for these people so callously disposed of. Without this story, this project would not have happened, and those people would still be forgotten. It is encouraging that journalists like these and many others have contributed important stories, although it is a little discouraging at the same time that more than 100 years after Nellie Bly, it is still necessary to expose abuses of people with illnesses. But journalists, even though they have done, as I have just noted, many important stories, nevertheless, may sometimes contribute to stigma in a number of ways. They may contribute to stigma, for example, by the use of slang and insensitive terminology to refer to people with mental illnesses. I believe this usage has diminished in recent years, certainly since I began work on the issue many years ago, although I'm not taking credit for that diminution. There are a lot of things that have gone on that have helped that. And there's certainly been improvement since 2002, when a New Jersey newspaper reported on a fire at a psychiatric hospital with the headline, "Roasted Nuts." I'm aware of no similarly egregious use of slang in the recent years, but terms like lunatic, psycho, maniac still do find their way into current news stories. Prior to giving this talk, I took a quick look at the LexisNexis database of newspaper stories focused on stories in the New York, New Jersey area in the past year. In those stories, slang still finds its way. Stabbings at the MoMA led to a madman, finding the psycho killer, a MAGA maniac, and a teen injured after a maniac does something. So how does this contribute to stigma? Well, first of all, it encourages public disrespect. The public sees and follows media models of slang and disrespectful reference to mental illnesses. A number of years ago, as Deborah mentioned, I published a book called Telling is Risky Business. The basis of that book was going to people with lived experience of mental illness and asking them about their experiences. Among the things that people told us that relate to this topic, one person said, "I have been called bad names by people in my community when they learned I had a mental illness." Another said, "Because I had dark hair and brown eyes and was white and slender and built kind of lanky, I was given the name Norman, as in Norman Bates from the movie Psycho." News stories that use slang encourage that kind of disrespect. Such slang causes people with mental illnesses who are the subjects of that slang to feel disrespected, devalued, hurt, and alienated from their communities. As one person said, "I hear people making jokes about people with mental illnesses. A lot of them would say, 'Oh, it's harmless.' But to me, it was hurtful." Use of slang also provides a message that the feelings of people with mental illnesses do not count as much as those of other groups. Other groups are provided, if you will, political correctness. It is hard to imagine speaking about other disabled individuals with such disparaging slang. And yet it still seems to be possible for us to do that without objection for mental illnesses. And that sends a message to people that their feelings, their objections to it, their hurt by those terms doesn't count. Not surprisingly, those slang references may cause damage to the self-esteem of people with mental illnesses who are the subjects of such references. When you're told, said one person, either verbally or non-verbally, that you're not as good and not as good as others, it starts to sink in after a while, especially when your defenses are down in the first place because of low self-esteem. So what can journalists do? Well, I have simple advice that's a lot like the old joke about the doctor. When the patient goes to see the doctor and says, "Doctor, it hurts when I turn my head this way," and the doctor says, "Then don't do that." So what can journalists do about offensive slang? Don't do it. Avoid slang and disrespectful terms like psycho and loony and maniac and lunatic and madman, etc. If you're uncertain about what these terms are, about what terms are acceptable and what ones are unacceptable, there are many guides that are quite explicit about terminology, this being one really quick one. And I'm going to talk later about some other guides that might be useful. Journalists may also contribute to stigma by reference to people as their disorders. Again, articles from the LexisNexis included these: an article referring to the schizophrenic man, another talking about, excuse me, a man who is schizophrenic, or a poet who was said to be schizophrenic. What this does, how this contributes to stigma, it first of all encourages the public to think of people as their disorders, rather than as multifaceted human beings. When we talk of a person as being schizophrenic, we are literally saying that's what they are, that's what defines them. This is dehumanizing. A person with a gallbladder problem is not a gallbladder. People with cancer are not the cancerous. People with schizophrenia are not schizophrenics. It also encourages the public to think that the type of mental illness is the main thing to know about this person. That that's what's important. That's what helps to define them. It encourages a focus on the disability, the illness, rather than the person coping with that illness. And it also implies that the treatment is untreatable, that the condition is untreatable and unchangeable. If you are obsessive compulsive, that's not going to go away. You are not going to be otherwise. That is the implication. So once again, what can journalists do? They can use people-first language. For example, a person with schizophrenia, an individual diagnosed with bipolar disorder, people living with obsessive compulsive disorder. This puts emphasis on the person rather than the illness, which indicates that mental illness is just one part of a person, not the thing that characterizes that person, and which is consistent with preferred language within the larger disability community. As one person in our study said, mental illness is just a piece of a person. A person is composed of so many more pieces than mental illness. I am more than a diagnosis. I am a whole person, and I deserve to be treated as a whole person. A particularly significant way that journalists may contribute to stigma is by association of mental illness with violence. In a recent study by McGinty et al. In 2016, looking at trends in news media coverage over a long period of time, they examined news stories from 1995 to 2014 in 7 high circulation newspapers, including the New York Times, USA Today, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and the evening news programs on 3 major networks and all news on CNN. They found that overall 55%, more than half of all news stories mentioned violence related to mental illnesses. If we think back, if you look back at the articles that I showed you that had slang, you may have already noticed that each of those involved a report of violence, museum stabbings, psycho killers, an attack on a Cincinnati FBI office, and a teen killed and injured after being stabbed. As the authors concluded, McGinty et al., the proportion of they also noted, I'm sorry, not a conclusion, they also noted that the proportion of newspaper stories about interpersonal violence related to mental illness that appeared on the front page increased from 1% in the first decade of the study to 18% in the second decade. Those instances are being given even more prominent coverage now than they were a decade ago. This, of course, reinforces the common misconception that people with mental illnesses are violent and dangerous. This, in turn, fosters fear and avoidance, as observed by some of the people we spoke to in our study. One said, if you mention you are going to see a psychiatrist, people get kind of panicky. They think maybe you're going to attack them. It increases the experience of isolation and exclusion. People who fear those who have mental illnesses, even those who have been to mental health treatment, do not want to be around them. They stay away from them. They avoid them. Even people who have had previous contact, friends, sometimes cut off contact. Another person said, I've seen some people kind of shy away from my work area. They would, instead of walking past a work area to their desk, they'd walk around the work area, take a slightly longer route to get to their desk because they're afraid of the nut at one end of the office. And there's concern even among people with mental illnesses about what impact this will have. People fear the reactions of other people. They are reluctant, as Deborah suggested, to disclose their illnesses because they are fearful of the avoidance and the rejection and the exclusion and the isolation. One woman we talked to even said, I see so often stories of people with mental illness who are violent that I sometimes wonder whether I myself might become violent sometime. Everybody tells me that people with mental illnesses are invariably violent. And the notion that people with mental illness are violent and dangerous underpins a great deal of the discrimination and limitations and opportunities that they experience. In such things as employment. It is difficult for someone with a history of mental illness to get a job. In education, I myself have dealt with the review of applications of people to clinical psychology graduate programs who, when they reveal a history of psychiatric disorder, questions are raised about whether they are stable enough to be in the program. In housing, it is difficult for people with mental illnesses, if they disclose their past history, to get housing. And a basic element of this is often the fears of employers, of educators, of landlords, that these individuals with histories of mental illness could go off at any time and harm other employees, other residents. One person even noted that they were excluded from volunteer work. You cannot imagine, she said, my shock and anger when I reached the part on the YMCA volunteer staff application that reads, please note that volunteers who are being treated for any emotional or mental illness will not be admitted. So what can journalists do? Well, first of all, they can provide more balanced coverage and reduce the tendency to focus so heavily on crime in news stories. They can also provide more counterbalancing stories of success and recovery, so that people do not see people only in the context of disability and violence. And when a story of crime committed by a person with mental illness must be told, there are instances where crimes are committed by people with mental illnesses. Journalists can help, excuse me, I'm recovering from a bit of a virus. Journalists can help by not promoting the stories with sensational or fear-provoking headlines, by not framing the stories with reference to other stories of mental illness and violence. Very often there will be an incident, and the story will then mention other incidents of violence involving mental illnesses, as if this is all part of an ongoing pattern that happens all the time. They can be careful not to imply that mental illness is the explanation for the violence that has occurred. Violence is a very complicated phenomenon, and there are many, many factors that contribute to it. And many of the factors that contribute to violence in our society are the same ones that contribute to violence among people with mental illnesses. Both men and women, for example, have mental illnesses. Primarily males are involved in violence. Mental illness does not account for that. Mental illness occurs in countries across the world, but mainly our country is one where violence is so common. Mental illness cannot account for that. Nevertheless, oftentimes in stories, particularly ones involving actions that are hard to fathom, reporters latch onto, the public latches onto, a simple explanation. Oh, obviously, it must be mental illness. And when those stories about mental illness and violence must be written, reporters can put that violence in perspective with some facts. They might mention that the vast majority of people with mental illnesses are neither violent nor dangerous. They might mention that the vast majority of violent crimes in the United States are committed by people without mental illnesses. They might mention that a person with a mental illness is far more likely to be a victim of crime than a perpetrator. Journalists may also contribute to stigma by the omission of positive or recovery stories. In McGinty's studies, once again, he found that only 14% of the news stories they looked at included any mention of the possibility of successful treatment or recovery, which reinforces the common misconception that mental illness doesn't go away, that people with mental illnesses do not get better. We don't see them get better. Not only, then that says, if we combine that with the misconception about violence, says not only do we believe they're violent, but they will always be violent because they can't be treated and they don't get well. So they will always remain a threat to the community. In a previous study we did of newspaper content some years ago, one of the things we also noted was that the perspectives or opinions of people with mental illnesses were largely absent. Only 10% of the articles written included people with mental illnesses commenting on or being asked about mental health. That's a little like doing an article on an educational curriculum and not talking to any teachers. It gives the impression that people with mental illnesses are not competent to speak for themselves, and or that their perspectives do not matter. As one person said, Esso Leti, I can talk, but I may not be heard. I can make suggestions, but they may not be taken seriously. I can report my thoughts, but they may be seen as delusions. I can report my experiences, but they may be interpreted as fantasies. To be a patient is to be discounted. So what can journalists do? Of course, provide more stories of successful recovery and treatment. As Deborah has suggested, there are lots of those, even though we don't hear about them as much. They can provide more stories of the many ordinary, well-functioning citizens with mental illness. And they can include the voices and viewpoints of people with mental illnesses. Not only will this broaden understanding of the issues involved, because people with mental illnesses have important perspectives. They're the ones in the treatment system. They're the ones living with the illness. They're the ones suffering the consequences of stigma. But it will also show people in the reading audience or listening audience that people with mental illnesses can be thoughtful, reasoning, and well-informed citizens, as well as provide a much needed model of inclusion. For all of the above mentioned issues and more ideas, journalists might consult available style guides, of which there are an increasing number. The Associated Press style book, for example, is probably a good place to start. In 2013, that guidebook added a section on the coverage of mental health and mental health issues, with executive editor Kathleen Carroll noting, quote, "It is the right time to address how journalists handle questions of mental illness in coverage. This isn't only a question of which words one uses to describe a person's illness. There are important journalistic questions too. There are many other guides, as I've mentioned. One of, I think, the more comprehensive ones is one created by the Carter Center for Mental Health Journalism. This book contains discussions of the issues as well as very specific guidelines for how to cover issues of mental health. For those of you not familiar with the Rosalind Carter Fellowships for Mental Health Journalism, I might just say a word or two about them because you might be interested in them. The Carter Center, and in particular Rosalind Carter, who has had a longstanding interest in mental health issues, created the Carter Center Fellowships in order to improve media coverage of mental illnesses. It offers a fellowship, a paid fellowship. Reporters apply, and if they are selected, if they and their proposed stories are selected, they receive a $10,000 fellowship and are mentored by the fellowship's board of advisors, which include both mental health advocates and professional journalists and editors. As Deborah mentioned, I served on this board for a number of years, who will help them with their stories, the end result being the number of very good stories relating to mental health and mental illness in the media are increasing. And of course, there are many other guides from many other countries. The Time to Change program in the United Kingdom, among other things, has produced guidelines for media and mental health. The South African Federation for Mental Health has produced them. Mindset, which is a group from Canada, has produced one. The American Public Media has produced one. And the National Union of Journalists, which is an organization in the UK, and in Ireland, has also produced one, and there are many others as well that could certainly be consulted for advice. Now, I've talked mainly about journalism because that's what this conference is about, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the entertainment media, who also play a role in informing the public about mental illnesses through their own portrayals. And recently, for example, a study by the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative looked at 200 popular films that appeared in 2019. They found that in those films, more than 40% of the characters with a mental health condition were the object of humor or jokes about their mental health. They found that almost 3/4 of the mentally ill characters experienced some form of disparagement. And more than half of them, almost 2/3 of them, were shown as perpetrators of violence. Many of the same issues we've just talked about in journalism, but maybe even more so. It's not surprising then that there also have been guides for the entertainment media. The Entertainment Industries Council, in particular, which is a collaborative effort of mental health advocates and Hollywood media professionals, has put together guides, including this one, for filmmakers and scriptwriters that have suggestions about how best to depict people with mental illnesses in their films. Now, apart from all of this, I want to kind of close with some general advice passed on to me by people living with mental illnesses. When you cover stories related to mental illness, keep in mind that most people with mental illnesses are ordinary citizens working to achieve job, family, and personal goals. And as I talked about this, the people in these pictures are all people who live with mental illnesses. Keep in mind that most people with mental illnesses, as we've said before, are neither violent nor criminal. They are our relatives, our co-workers, our neighbors, our friends, as well as sometimes ourselves. And they deserve reporting that informs without harming. And with that, I'm going to turn to the panel, but first I need to give credit where credit is due. The pictures I have shown you come from two sources, two books. The first, Images from Within, by reporter Alicia Hauser and photographer Mark Hauser, features 34 adults from all walks of life who tell briefly about their experiences and aspirations. Nothing to Hide by social workers Jan Beard and Peggy Gillespie is based on a traveling photo exhibit showing 44 diverse families who have dealt with mental illnesses within their homes. These are excellent books that help to go beyond the symptomatology of mental illness for a glimpse at the real people who are not mentally ill, but have mental illnesses. Thank you very much. With that, I turn it back over briefly to Deborah before we have our panel conversation.
Well, thank you. That was more than informative. It was absolutely gives us an enormous amount to both think about, to use, and a lot of things that we now should no longer be doing. When I say we, I'm talking about the greater media and anybody who writes about mental illnesses and the people who have them. So I do want to note, and while I'm talking, I'm going to have both Dr. Wall, who's going to moderate the panel, and our panelists will be taking a brief break, but I will be introducing them. So we want to really just again thank Dr. Wall because his presentation did present a tremendous amount of critical information and profound insights that will help everyone be more aware of the language that they use and to take conscious efforts to remove stigma in their conversations and writing. So the panel discussion, when they return, will build on what Dr. Wall presented, and representatives of various media, as well as individuals with stigma and individuals with learned experience, will share their experiences and perspectives on stigma in the media and how situations involving individuals with mental illness can be reported on in a non-stigmatizing way. So I'm going to take a few minutes to give you a brief introduction to who the panelists are. Emily Grossman has worked in mental health for more than a decade, beginning on the front lines as a peer specialist in community mental health in New Jersey. She's currently the director of the Training Institute at Coordinated Behavioral Care and has a small private peer specialist practice. She holds a master's in education from Columbia University. Shauna Moses is the Vice President of Public Affairs and Member Services at the New Jersey Association of Mental Health and Addiction Agencies and a board member for Attitudes in Reverse, which provides mental health and suicide prevention education programs. Shauna earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in Communications from the College of New Jersey, formerly Trenton State College. Lilo Staton has been a healthcare writer for New Jersey Spotlight News since 2016. She's covered New Jersey for 2 decades, reporting on public policy, national political conventions, and the 9/11 attack on Lower Manhattan. She later served as press secretary to Governor John Corzine and led a successful advocacy for federal funding in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. Valerie Kennedy is a publishing editor for Mental Health Weekly and publication manager of Alcoholism and Drug Abuse Weekly and Climate and Energy and several Brown University titles. Valerie has contributed to various other national and regional media and appeared on Good Morning America and Connecticut Public Television. Valerie received her Master of Science degree in journalism from Northwestern. Marie Berna is president of Dominion Behavioral Health Policy, LLC, and a contributing writer for Best Version Media's monthly publications. She focuses on educating people in her own community about mental illness and substance use disorders. Marie has worked as a consumer advocate for more than 25 years and believes that becoming educated is the very first thing everyone should do. So with those introductions, and I am so thrilled for the array of journalists and people with lived experience on our panel, and want to thank them in advance on behalf of the Council on Mental Health Stigma for lending their time and expertise to today's discussion. It's now my pleasure to turn the program back over to Dr. Wall, who will moderate the panel.
Thank you. Let me first tell a little bit about what we're going to do with this panel. As we were discussing putting this presentation together, we wanted the panel to be able to provide information that they wanted to provide and that might supplement the remarks that I have already made. What we did was to come up with a number of questions to pose to the panelists and let them decide which ones they thought were the most important and which ones they felt the most comfortable responding to. So, and then we kind of divided them up among panel members. So each panel member will be posed a question or two or few, to which they will respond for about 7 to 8 minutes. After each of the panelists have had an opportunity to respond to the question designated for them, we will then have a question and answer period for both myself, which I forgot to do at the end of mine, and for the panel. So with that, our first speakers, our first panelists, will be Emily Grossman and Shauna Moses, not at the same time, but taking turns. And they will respond to the question, how has coverage of mental illnesses affected you personally as a person with lived experience? Emily, you want to start?
Of course. Thank you so much, Dr. Wall. And thank you for that very insightful keynote presentation. It was really quite informative for me. So again, my name is Emily Grossman, and I direct the CBC Training Institute Coordinated Behavioral Care, which is in New York City. And what my intro did not say about me is, besides being a person with lived experience, I'm a person living in recovery for 13 years from bipolar disorder, and from a very serious case of bipolar disorder that had me in and out of the hospital about 12 times, nearly institutionalized, and really struggling and suffering. And I now live in recovery and don't have symptoms of bipolar disorder anymore. So that's been an incredible journey, and I'm really happy to be on this panel today to talk about my experiences with the media and stigma. So I want to first cover the negative experiences. I was first diagnosed at age 18, and this was in 1996, so it was before a lot of the celebrities were coming out and speaking about their own mental health struggles. And I'd heard nothing about mental illness. I mean, we didn't cover it in my health class. So I had very limited exposure. And the only exposure I really had was what I saw in the media, which, as Dr. Wall so eloquently covered, it was about killers and criminals. And even on TV, there was this archetype or this stereotype of the crazed woman. I remember a show that I was very much into at the time, Beverly Hills 90210. Some of you may remember that show from the 90s. there was one of the main characters' girlfriends, Emily, what ironically her name was Emily, was diagnosed with a mental illness, and she was the one who burned the float for homecoming, and she was always causing trouble. That was the stereotype, and I saw that in other movies, and Fatal Attraction, where Glenn Close, who became later a wonderful mental health advocate, but at the time she was in this movie Fatal Attraction, which many of you may remember, which is, I believe she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and she famously boiled her boyfriend's bunny. So, this was what I was seeing and hearing in the media, and I was diagnosed right in college, and was very, very afraid to get treatment because of all that I had heard about people with mental illness. I just did not want to be associated with it. And, I wanted to be a quote unquote normal college student. I didn't want this extra label to be on me. And, it really did make me second guess getting treatment. I was very fortunate that my parents were very supportive of therapy and treatment. And even though I was in and out of treatment for many, many years, the media really did play a role in making it harder for me to really accept and love myself despite my mental illness. And honestly, now I feel a lot of love for myself because of my mental illness and my recovery journey. So those were some of the more negative things I experienced. Also, as Dr. Wall covered so brilliantly, this idea that shooters and criminals are diagnosed sometimes by the media, not by mental health professionals, as people living with mental illness. And that's been a real point of frustration for me because, how can you diagnose someone after the fact? That's problematic to me. And armchair psychologists are not the best kind of people to make these diagnoses. So that I'm really glad that Dr. Wall covered that. And so those were some of my negative experiences in the media. More recently, though, I've had some deeply positive experiences of being covered myself in the media and how I think things can really transform. So I want to end on a hopeful note telling you about a few of those. So I made the decision to be written about in the Montclair local. I live in Montclair, New Jersey, and I wrote a story, or they wrote a story about me and my recovery journey. And I thought it was handled so sensitively. And the reason I made the decision to come out is because I wanted my neighbors, my friends, people that were local to know that they were living amongst someone with a mental illness and that that person was a functioning, happy, wonderful, I'm not shooting my own horn here, but, a contributor to society, and the result was so positive. I had neighbors coming up to me and saying, I didn't know that that was part of your story. I would have never suspected that about you. And saying just very affirming things about how wonderful it is to come out and talk about it. And neighbors of all ages, races, it was really a positive experience. And after I speak, I'm going to put the link in the chat to that story if anyone is curious about it. I was also covered in Teen Vogue, giving my impressions as a person with lived experience of anxiety about college age anxiety and how it can be prevented. So when Dr. Wall said it's important for people with mental illness to be covered sharing their opinions, I think that's a very important thing. And then I was in the New York Times Magazine. I wrote a letter to the editor on a story that they had written about peer support. And that story, that letter to the editor became a part of New York Times Magazine for that day, and I really felt validated that my opinions mattered, and got some really nice feedback on that as well. So, and I do write for Huffington Post and have written for Huffington Post, and I really appreciated that many of those journal articles have also become published and gotten some good feedback. So I do see a change happening, and I'm really grateful about the change. And I really want to encourage those of you who are out there who are living with mental illness that we are the solution to the problem, because when we speak out in the media, we are turning the dial and changing things for the way people are perceived with mental illness. So I'm going to leave that there and turn it back over to Dr. Wall.
Thank you, Emily. Well said. Shauna, you're on.
Sorry
Okay.
about that.
Yep.
I just remember to put it back on when I'm done. I've been fortunate. I haven't had direct negative impacts of the media coverage of people with mental illness, although I am aware of it. I have been aware of it over the years, seeing a lot of movies, but even more aware from discussions with everyone on the panel today and Dr. Wolf as we were planning this discussion. So became even more aware of it. And I know it's been in the media, and I guess I tend to shelter myself from bad news. I mean, I'm not completely unaware of what's going on, but since I have depression, I know I can be kind of easily triggered. So I limit my exposure to the news to a degree. My experience with the media has been positive, but I'll give a little background leading up to the media coverage. Is that I did lose a very close family member to suicide, and Stigma was, looking back in retrospect, I now see we had stigma in the family because I didn't know he had bipolar disorder until I found out he died by suicide. So it was a double shock for me. And then I was diagnosed with depression soon after that happened, and I was given the recommendation to go into therapy, and I was resistant to it because back then I didn't understand mental illness. I knew therapy existed, but I'm sure I had a ton of misconceptions about it, thinking, oh, it's going to make me happy. It's going to deny my feelings. I should be in mourning, and I'm going to be depressed for a long time. I lost someone so close to me. Well, death is always horrible, but that's one of the worst ways to lose somebody. And it's like, I'm going to just have to work through it, however long it'll take. I was told by my husband at the time and my family that I wasn't there for my son as much as I should be. Not that I was neglecting him or anything like that, but I wasn't there emotionally because I was withdrawn in my own depression. And that encouraged me to try therapy, and tried that for a while and was on medication. And after a while, I made my own decision that I don't need the therapy or depression. I'm functioning much better. I am there for my son more fully now. And, so I just stopped that. And then a few years after that, I did have a suicidal crisis for a lot of different reasons, things just piling up that I saw as completely negative, which triggered the depression even more and sent me on a downward spiral. Then I started working New Jersey Association of Mental Health and Addiction Agencies. And when I saw the job opportunity, it's a writing position, primarily advocacy, media relations. I have to be there. That just struck a chord with me because of what my close family member who died by suicide went through, and what I went through to some degree. And this was before my crisis, so my timeline's a little circular here. But anyway, so this is where I'm meant to be. And I've been here 16 years so far. And with Attitudes in Reverse, as Deb mentioned in my bio, which is about mental health and suicide prevention. So anyway, after I had my crisis in 2012, and I witnessed firsthand all the amazing work that the JAMA members do, because I was at a Carrier Clinic, one of our member agencies, I felt compelled to share my firsthand experience with how the providers really make a difference. So my first op-ed piece, opinion editorial piece, was published, I believe it was only like 2 or 3 months after my hospitalization in Carrier Clinic. And it was a tribute to mental health providers. And it was my first public sharing of my experience. And I've had several op-eds published since then over the years, a couple letters to editors, which for those who may not be in the media, smaller versions of op-eds basically, and they're always great to get published because it gets that word out there. So that was very positive that the media were open to publishing my point of view and others that I've seen. And also I was reached out to be interviewed. I was 101.5, which now that we have the internet, it's not just on the radio for 5 seconds, it's a long video, and it's out, I guess it's still out there. And actually that reminds me of a negative, not anything that the media had done, but just showing the stigma among people in general. Is a friend of mine said, you should get that taken off the internet. It's going to be there forever. It's going to haunt you. It's going to cause really bad negative consequences. And I'm like, no, because by then I'm very out there and open and an advocate, and I want to help people. And people commented, they seen my op-ed or they seen that video, and they said, really appreciate that you spoke up. And so I don't want to have it taken down. If it helps one person or 100 or 1,000, whatever, it's such a great feeling, and that's therapeutic for me as well. So I'm sorry, I'm getting off the media tangent a bit, so I'm just going to glance at my notes for a second. I just want to reinforce what Emily and Dr. Wall had said, is that the best ways to get rid of stigma is for people with mental illness to share their stories. Their stories of recovery, their stories of how they're enjoying and maximizing their life despite having depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress or any other kind of mental illness. And to have those stories shared in the media, that's an extra reinforcement. One thing that struck me, and I put it in the chat, so you don't have to comment on it later, Dr. Wall, is you mentioned about there needs to be more stories in the media about people successfully treated and progressing in their recovery. And I wholeheartedly agree. The challenge, I'm guessing, though, is that that's not a news hook in itself. The crime and the violence and the shootings and all these horrible things, that's what's going to get the front page because that's a news hook. So I don't know the answer is. I mean, I guess the more successes people with mental illness have, that needs to be more prominent in the media. I think the celebrities certainly help with that, like Michael Phelps, Jared Padalecki's an actor who's been very open about his mental health struggles. And there are so many others that I'm just not thinking of all their names right now. So I would like to be on the mission with everybody to just try to create those opportunities to make it the news hook that it needs to be. And that'll, I think, will get the media more on board, more of the media representatives on board and giving those positive depictions of mental illness. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna and Emily. And I think there is a hook in the stories that you tell. I think they are wonderful stories. They are inspiring stories. They are the kind of stories, in fact, that do get audiences. It's a little bit of a misconception that, in fact, I think people in the media have, that it's the crime and violence stories that gets their audiences, because there actually have been some studies done that said that people are getting kind of tired of that, and they actually respond better and read more those kinds of inspiring success stories that you and Emily have provided.
That's so great to hear. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, we asked Lilo Staten to respond to the questions, to a couple of questions as follows. What kinds of things are currently being done within your medium to encourage accurate and non-stigmatizing depictions of mental illnesses? And what do you perceive as the major obstacles to improved depiction? Lilo?
Well, Dr. Wall, thank you so much. And I want to thank Deb and Shauna for having me. It's been great to work with you over the years and to see the good work you have done. Shauna and Emily, I'm just really touched by your stories and proud of what you have done to share them. So I have a couple thoughts, Dr. Wall. Your presentation was really interesting. And I think it's important to remember, first of all, and I'm not suggesting you were saying this, but that not all media is the same, right? I mean, there is a big difference between the New York Times and the New York Post. There is, you know, I work for what is now New Jersey Public Media, NJPBS. We're a division of WNET in New York, which is public media in New York. We don't do crime and violence. I mean, we do violence and we do crime, but we don't report on break-ins and the murder down the street for obvious reasons. We have a statewide focus. We cover, you know, policy. That doesn't mean that that we aren't responsible, of course, for perpetrating stigma. And I think a couple things. I think some of this is changing as we've sort of discussed. Just generationally, I think there is a greater acceptance of, you know, mental health challenges in general. I think, you know, there is a huge sense that there's a commonality here, and that more and more people, as we talk about it more, I should note, you know, I'm also a consumer. I don't mention this in stories, but I've been in therapy off and on over the years. I've been on sertraline for a very, very long time, probably allows me to focus and do what I do. So I'm very thankful for that. But I think, you know, there are a couple things. First of all, when we talk about a news hook and sort of what gets in the media, it is unfortunate that those sort of recovery stories are undershared. I would argue part of that is because the media tends to focus on exposing problems. And like every organization, you know, we have, well, at least public media, we have limited resources, right? Only so many, you know, weeks in the year, days in the week, and time in the day to do these stories. So if you have a, you know, psychiatric hospital that is failing thousands of patients or residents, I think that's the kind of story that, you know, an editor will no doubt push up as a value above the end of the story of an individual who may represent thousands of others, but it's not, there's a balancing act that goes on with all these stories, and it's very hard for an individual success story to win in those balancing tests, because we see our role as warning, as drawing attention to things, not necessarily celebrating. So with that, I think it's fabulous that you mentioned, Shauna, the op-eds, and Emily, the use of HuffPost. I think, and, you know, local media, your Patches, your Montclair presses, whatever it is, these are opportunities. All of these entities have space to fill now, right? And they need help. So they desperately want to hear from people. I think that is a very positive opportunity. I think, you know, the more that you can flood them with positive stories or stories about things that need attention, the better. So I would say, please do that. I think some of traditionally the issues, the stigma issues, and particularly, you know, roasted nuts. I was thinking of that headline, Dr. Wall, before you got there, because that is really historic in New Jersey. That headline reflects a lot of problems. One of the main problems is the goal of those editors is not, it's never to be sensitive. I mean, I'm not saying they're insensitive people, or were. I actually, one of the two reporters on that story I worked with for a long time, Tom Baldwin, you know, it is not that they are necessarily bad people, but the prerogative there is to sell papers, and roasted nuts is the kind of headline that draws attention. It doesn't make it right. It just means they're coming at it with this tunnel vision of drawing attention to the thing. I think the other issue that we run into is traditionally we've been hemmed in the media, particularly in tabloids, by time and space. And space is an issue because I'm thinking of the importance of language. And we talked about, you know, and some of the comments, Dr. Wall, that you had from the people in your surveys were really powerful, because when I started in this business, it was the disabled, it was the mentally ill. It might not even be mentally ill. It might be, you know, some previous iteration of that was far less sensitive. So part of the reason that they did that is because that is shorter than saying individuals with mental illness. It's fewer words. It literally squeezes into a smaller space. That's how things like nuts, psycho, all those buzzwords that you mentioned get developed, because they fit tightly and people immediately have a vision. I mean, they're very successful in that way. We are now much less constrained by time and space. We also, I would argue, think more about this. At our publication, we are going through a huge debate right now internally over how to handle. I mean, we no longer say disabled, the disabled. We hopefully are past that. We're very conscious of resident versus, patient when we're talking about someone at skilled nursing, for example. We're going through an issue right now with pregnant people. In the policy world, there is no longer an assumption that a person who is pregnant is female by gender, right? Or there may be gender fluidity involved, or all kinds of options. So we talk about pregnant people. The media hasn't necessarily caught up yet. And this is a process. And I think one thing to keep in mind is it's not a switch, can't turn it off and on. A lot of it is ruled by the Associated Press style book, which is sort of where we go. It's like our Bible to figure out, if we can't answer the question internally, it's always up to the AP. And, publications build their own style and they build their own systems and choices, but that takes time. And one reporter may be doing it one day and the other may not. It takes a while for the whole sort of ship to turn and to get on board. But I'd like to think we're getting better there. We're certainly not, we're certainly paying a lot of attention to it. I was thinking, I saw something on CBS, I think it was 60 Minutes, and there in Maine, the director of the state prison there has changed the way they talk about the inmate population, and he now talks about residents, not prisoners. And I thought it's such a powerful difference, right? If you're a resident, you have a stake in it. If you're a prisoner, you are literally kept captive. So I think that's very important. I think another thing that we're doing at NJ Spotlight and NJPBS is it's the choice of stories. We have made a conscious choice this year to focus far more on mental health issues, partly because of the growing need, right? We see the same statistics that you do about the growth. We experience it personally. I mean, there are so many colleagues of mine that I can talk about that have had these, situations in their own family where they didn't know whether to take their son or daughter to an emergency room, or do you wait 2 months for the first appointment to open up at, the school counselor's office, or what do you do? And, so these are things that affect us too. So we are becoming much more aware of them as stories. I would say we all dream of doing those great exposés, those sort of, those like Cliff Levy's work. That's sort of everybody, at least in the sort of policy investigation world that I live in, that's your big goal. But those stories take an enormous amount of resources and time and attention. And again, that's something we tend to be lack of. It's not that they're not important. It's just this everyday balancing of having to, we do it in all our jobs. You have to balance things you really want to do long-term with the work you actually have to get done every day. And it's a terrible, terrible dilemma. But I think we have made a lot of progress in just writing more on a weekly, almost sometimes daily basis about studies that show growing need, programs that are doing novel things. The 988 line, we've covered that a lot. Big shout out to my colleague Bobby Breyer, who we brought on, who is a dedicated beat covering mental health, particularly in rural communities in New Jersey. That essentially doubles our capacity, with me being the healthcare reporter traditionally covering all aspects of healthcare. That doubles our capacity to tell these stories. And I think that is a huge, huge important thing. I would say, I think if I may, one of the concerns that I still have is this connection with violence. I found myself going through this with the story I was working on about the Uvalde shooter, having a conversation with the psychologist, and I said to him, in a way, how could that person not be crazy on some level? And he helped me walk that back. And I started to think about how we as journalists connect violence and mental health. And some of it I kept thinking of these concentric circles. We tend to, sometimes we don't have all the information. So the information we have, we try to put in context in what we've learned. And, certain things. There were these, a homeless population, for example, there is a huge prevalence of mental illness in that. There may also be a tendency toward violence, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the mental illness is what's causing the violence. And I think, so we get these things that are sort of, I wrote down association versus cause. I mean, there are all kinds of information that we get as reporters. And when you're on a deadline, you tend to put these things in a story. And, it's like you throw everything in the pot and you don't always necessarily think, well, is the carrot really going to make the beef taste better? What's the connection between these two things? If I put in the mental illness, what does that say to someone about this person's violent act? And is the mental illness something that they just diagnosed yesterday? I mean, what about the fact that he has, chronic hypertension, or, maybe he was dehydrated. I mean, I know people who have become hallucinated because of dehydration. So, what about a person's history is these little snippets that you get as a reporter, and it's never the full chart. We never have that full picture. And I think we need to do a better job thinking very carefully about the associations we're suggesting, what we know is causal, what we don't know, and how these things sort of fit together and create that final stew. What is the taste we're leaving our readers with? And I think we need to be very conscious about that, because we tend to throw everything in based on what we have and not necessarily think through how it's all connected. My final thing is, when you talked about Dr. Wall, this is sort of, I always try to go back and check myself. How would I do this if this was diabetes? How would I do this if this was cancer? And I thought you said it so well. We don't call them the cancers, we don't call them, the diabetics anymore. And so, although we probably do say that more than we should, but that I think is a really important sort of bottom line. It's an illness, it's a diagnosis, it should be treated as all other illnesses and diagnoses. So with that, I hope we can do better.
As do I. I thank you for your comments and for your perspectives, and you certainly are, as our other panelists so far, an example of why we have a panel of people who can provide different perspectives, who can look at the issue from different angles and not just be stuck with what some speaker has to say. So thank you. Our next speaker, Valerie Kennedy. We asked her to address questions the following. What is the most successful or satisfying story about mental illness from your work that you can recall? And what did it take to accomplish that? And how can mental health advocates be helpful to media professionals to accomplish improved depiction? What do you need from them? Valerie?
Thank you very much, Dr. Wall, and thank you for your presentation. It's very informative and enlightening. I also want to take a moment to thank both Deborah and Shauna for inviting me to be a part of this very, very interesting and important panel discussion. As you all mentioned in the beginning, I'm a publishing editor for Mental Health Weekly and a reporter. And I've been working on the publication for many, many years now, more than 17 years. So when I'm asked to select a successful story, it's a little hard it's a little challenging to narrow it down. There have been some really important stories over the years, significant ones more recently, 988, the new crisis and suicide prevention hotline is certainly one that we've covered quite a bit and even all in the months leading up to this important crisis number. And then we also report on treatment advances and research studies, mental health initiatives, and federal and state policies, and stories that really have a national impact for the field overall. And I guess I should also indicate that our readership includes community mental health providers and mental health advocates, behavioral health organizations, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers. So we pretty much have a really large readership. And so this work that I do, it's been very important to be reporting on issues in the field and letting the field know what's going on out there. Now, we publish 48 issues a year. And so if I had to take a look at something I think is a success, and maybe it can be considered a success in the making, if you will, is the Mental Health Parity and Addiction, Equity Act of 2008. You know, as you all know, requiring group and health plans and health insurance companies to ensure that benefits for mental health and substance use disorders are on par with medical benefits. And we wrote about the push for parity in the months leading up to its enactment. And as you all mentioned too, it has a way to go. There's still a lot more that has to be done to ensure comprehensive parity and to ensure full enforcement. And even at state parity levels, there's lawsuits and all kinds of things going on. And even as Deborah mentioned before, earlier in her presentation, even with parity, people are still no longer receiving the clinical care they need. You know, and stigma is also playing a part in that. And to work on that parity story, we followed legislative hearings and briefings, news releases, and we talked to members of organizations and groups that have been trying to push for parity. We talked to them following their appearances, maybe at public forums or legislative sessions, to get their feedback and their input on what's happening and how important it is. And I try to keep the readers up to date even now on these various challenges and these lawsuits that have been occurring when insurers are not doing what they need to do to ensure parity for individuals with mental illness. And so it's very important that we try and keep our readers informed. And if we have talked about something in the past, we kind of refer our readers to a previous article just to kind of enlighten them, but we'll also keep them up to date on what's occurring. And that continues. Parity, the federal parity law, a landmark law, if you will, that continues to be an important topic in this field, and one we will continue to cover. And we hope that enforcement will really occur very soon in this whole area. And so I've also, been asked to talk about what can advocates do, and what kind of information we as journalists need from them. And that is very important. I'm so happy to be in contact and be in constant contact, if you will, with a number of key mental health parity organizations, just to name a few: Mental Health America, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, National Council for Mental Wellbeing, just to name a few, NIAPRS. It's important that they keep our publication, informed on some of these important issues that are taking place in the field. And even we have a column in our mental health publication, from the field column. And so that's a column, and that's a section where we invite people in the field to talk to us about some of these latest develops, peer-led projects or initiatives, pilot programs, state or local advocacy, and the results of that, and how it's impacting their consumers, their people that they're in constant contact with. And more recently, we had a column written by Michael Polak, the CEO of the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. And he wanted to contribute to the From the Field column. And his title, if you will, was called Debunking the Myth of, quote unquote, the Mentally Ill Mass Shooter. And he gave this perspective on how people are always associating mental illness and violence. And I thought it was very important to provide that perspective. And it was coming from, following so many mass shootings and tragedies that not only happened this year, but in previous years. And we thought that was very important, to include his perspective on that. And as far as advocates, I think that's so important. You all have mentioned it time and time again during this panel discussion about these recovery stories. They need to be, we need to hear more about these recovery stories, and we need to hear more from people with lived experience and who can present their perspective on this. It's just so important too. And I want to also mention too that it's been a very long time since Mental Health Weekly even used the word mentally ill. We always say individuals with mental illness, people with mental illness. And so that's been very important in terms of change. And we keep up to date on the Associated Press and things that they might mention on how important it is and how we need to make sure that we report on mental illness correctly, using the right words and terminology. And I say too that the mental health advocates, they really do have an important role to play in helping us report more effectively on mental illness related topics, because the public still needs to be educated. They still need to be aware of mental illness. And so this is important that we get information from them to help promote anti-stigma efforts. And I really must say, I'm encouraged by some of these entertainers and celebrities that are bringing mental illness to the forefront, and the sports athletes as well. And, like Lady Gaga's foundation, the actress Taraji Henson, the entertainer Lizzo, all of them are talking about mental illness, bringing it to the forefront, leading people to important resources that they should have, and making it important to keep us all aware of mental illness. But as you all have mentioned, we still do have ways to go. And I find it important to continue reporting on mental illness and to continue talking about the struggles and the challenges this field continues to face. So I am appreciative of the advocates who bring us this information, whether it's from a peer-led initiative, as I mentioned earlier, from a personal perspective, from their experiences with lawmakers, who they're talking to their contribution to legislation. All of that is very important for us to tell our readers. And again, I'm really so pleased to be a part of this panel discussion, and I'm learning a lot more as we go along. So thank you.
And thank you. Thank you for your remarks. Thank you for your ongoing efforts to bring sensitive and important information about mental health and mental illness to your reading audience.
Thank you.
And last but not least, Maria Verna has agreed to talk with us and respond to the questions. What is the power of local coverage? And how is local media different from mass media? And what strategies can be employed with representatives of local media outlets? Marie?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wall, Otto. I've known Shauna, Otto, Debbie, Lilo, Emily for years. As my bio explained, I've been a mental health advocate, actually a behavioral health advocate, substance abuse and mental illness for almost 30 years. I've worked on just about every level, state, federal, local, even in some cases internationally. And I think that the path for me was always related to that feeling that when you're an advocate, sometimes you feel big. For me, the biggest moment of success for me was being involved in the enactment of the Mental Health Parity and Substance Abuse Equity Act. I knew it was just a law, and I knew that regs really, really are where, the rubber meets the road, but it still felt amazing. And that's one of the benefits of thinking big and having so many people behind you and being able to speak for so many people. However, over some years, especially in the last 4 years, when the language ascribed to people with mental illness and substance abuse has been so hurtful, I've actually found myself being more concerned about what I'm seeing on the local level. When I was an advocate, I kept a picture by my desk all the time, and I now keep it here at my home office, a saying that Mother Teresa said in her work: "We can do no great things, only small things with great love." And that is how I feel about the work I'm doing right now with Best Media. They publish monthlies, and they are my contributions as a contributing editor are published in 2 publications in Mercer County, Hopewell Valley News and the Lawrenceville News. So it was a sort of like a transition, but a very natural one, because I realized that just in my regular everyday life, people, every single time I said where I worked, it was either like the Mental Health Association of New Jersey or the Mental Health America. So the word mental health would come up. And then the reactions to people were sort of like accelerating into conversations about mental illness and substance use. So there was never any small talk. It went right there. And I realized, so I'm down, a woman's walking by my house with her dog. We stop and we talk, and she's telling me that her son goes to our local high school and all the kids know exactly where to go to get drugs. And everybody knows that they know. And so I would say to myself, well, then this is so relevant to my friend Doris. And I would see people, I remember a situation in the Quaker Bridge Mall. Those of you who live in Mercer County know that mall as our biggest mall. So I'm at a makeup counter, and a woman is doing makeup. And so she starts small talk, and she asks me what I do. And I say something about mental health advocacy. And her response was, "My brother committed suicide." And I thought to myself, oh my God, this is right here. These are these very small things that are happening to me that I still remember. I almost remember what I was wearing. And I realized, ooh, she thinks because I work in mental health that I attempted suicide. That's wild. So in the last couple of years, I've just come to this feeling that I want to do the local coverage, and mostly because people, I feel, in a regular old community, Hopewell Valley is a very wealthy community. But when we talk about Mercer County, we also talk about Trenton and every one of their suburbs that is not necessarily as wealthy as Hopewell Valley and Lawrenceville. So I felt as though the primary thing that I wanted to do was to let people know that it's happening around you. It is true that this child who you say will never do drugs might do drugs, might very well do drugs, might be doing them now. That neighbor whose house looks a little less perfect than yours might be dealing with mental health in the family, mental illness in the family, inside the house. They may be so exhausted and terrified that their house and the way it looks is not something that they're paying attention to. But it isn't about anybody's character. It's about real people's lives. And I felt as though those of us, we think about, forget about celebrities. We never really identify them with them, or big time sports people. I'm sure athletes want to be big sports characters, but we don't identify with their lives. But I identify with the life of a friend who discovers that I know something about mental illness, and they have all kinds of questions for me, and they don't know what to do. They simply don't know what to do. And I wanted to do something about that. So I approached the publisher. They were immediately interested, which surprised me because a lot of times the stories are about, sheep farms in Hopewell Valley or, art exhibits, not really serious things. And I asked the publisher, well, can you check with your editor, see if they're going to want to even cover something as serious as this? And the answer was absolutely. Absolutely. And even since I started writing for them in January, they brought on a regular columnist who's a therapist, and a story they did in the most recent edition was about a family dealing with mental illness. So these are all they're huge successes, but they're happening on little tiny newspapers. And this is what matters to me. I want people to know there is something you can do. Here's what you can do, sending them to resources that they just don't know about. You just don't know that there's a NAMI Mercer, that there's a mental health New Jersey. You don't know these things, and you feel all alone. And I want people to know they are nowhere near alone. I probably have talked to thousands and thousands and thousands of people who care about people managing behavioral health issues. And I want them to know that. And then the final thing I want them to know is that we're all working very hard in advocacy to make changes. And we actually have. We make changes. The AP Style Guide was major. The Mental Health Parity and Substance Use Equity Act was major. The Americans with Disabilities Act was major. Just in my short time as an advocate, 25 years, we have mental health first aid. We are trying to establish a nationwide training program that we hope will be exactly like CPR, so that when you're in the train station and you see somebody walking around, perhaps talking to themselves, or you see somebody terribly anxious, that you might have some knowledge about what to do for that person. So there are some small things that happened to me in my life, and I realize they're big, they're huge. And some of them are as small as a friend up the road who is a brilliant biochemist who worked for one of the companies that developed Abilify, one of our major antipsychotics. Unfortunately, he worked on a different disease state, so he didn't leave that company with much information about mental illness. But he knows I work in mental illness, and so when we get together on his deck, he likes to ask me questions and learn something. And his most recent question was, Marie, a friend just retired and he's feeling very depressed. He asked me what to do. And I said, maybe it'll pass. Maybe you feel like everybody does who retires and has a big loss. And I had to gently, because he is a friend, I had to gently suggest, well, you're a biochemist and you know neuroscience. And it just so happens that the best thing to have said to your friend was get some treatment, let a medicine help you. And then, Otto, you reminded me of something that was quite traumatic for me. I happened to be in a meeting when the Roasted Nuts story, when the fire broke out at Trenton Psych Hospital. I was at a meeting with religious leaders who were trying to get together and do something about mental health because they themselves did not know how to care for their congregants who had mental illness, and they had no idea what to do about some of the other congregants who simply didn't want them in the building. They did not want people who were talking to themselves to be sitting in the congregation at a service. So we were all talking. I'm not a religious leader, but I was very honored to be there. And all of a sudden somebody ran in and said, there's a fire at Trenton Psych. And then later we saw the headline, Roasted Nuts. Truly traumatic. And when you showed that slide, it kind of brought all that back to me, the trauma. I was absolutely paralyzed in what to do about this. It's too big. And fortunately, some fellow advocates who have been around longer than I have said, Marie, it's a perfect opportunity for education. So we worked very closely with NAMI, the state chapter, to handle that situation. Fortunately, the paper, I don't feel right mentioning it, but it is one of the papers that Lilo mentioned that really is just sensationalizing anything they possibly can. I don't know what font size that was. But we were horrified that would happen. And, you know, we worked with the writer. Actually, the writer of the article is not the person who came up with the caption. The caption was created by somebody who actually was a religious leader, but at midnight when they caption all the stories. And he was so sad that he contributed to Stigma in that way. And then so it's so strange that Lilo and Otto are mentioning this, because you're making me realize that in terms of local, it is such an amazing thing to me that I have a new neighbor down the street, and it's a couple, and the woman's father comes over very often. No, I'm sorry, the husband's father comes over very often. So they invited us down, and the father introduced himself as somebody who spent his career in publishing. And I love writing, I love communication, so I thought it was going to be a really interesting conversation. And then he found out I work in mental illness, in mental health. And so he brings up the story about Roasted Nuts. And I, of course, had the reaction, I just thought, oh, again. And it turns out his paper is the one that published that. And he was a managing editor. And he tried.
Marie, can you wrap this up?
Yes, I can. He
Okay.
tried to convince me that it was not really that bad, because who wouldn't have thought of that caption? Who wouldn't think that that's kind of funny? And I'll close with, I just turned to my husband and I said, do you think he's going to convince me that this was remotely funny? And I really just want to close on the localness of local coverage. Let it be that the people right around you are ones that are with you on this, but need kindness. We need to do small things with great love. I really appreciate the time that you've given me to just talk about this new little adventure of mine.
All right, thank you. I think that's another important perspective. We often do tend to focus so much on the large issues that we sometimes fail to recognize that people in our local communities, through our local media, need information and resources. So thanks again. That concludes the presentations by our panelists. We now are going to turn to our other participants for questions and comments. My technological limitations caused me not to really know how to do that. So I'm going to need some help to figure out how we identify questions and respond to them. Shauna, Deborah, can you guys help me?
Yeah, we'll ask people to put them in the chat and then we'll call on you and I think we can unmute you or we can ask you to unmute yourself at that point. So
Okay.
So right now,
Everybody got that? Put those questions in the chat and we'll, I guess, call on you and attempt to have panelists or myself respond to them. Any questions?
well, while we're waiting for questions to appear, I want to mention that while we were planning this, the whole issue of, and thank you, Dr. Wall, and then others for following up, Leela, on violence in the media and how the association, and that was a good word and a good explanation, because I had spent quite a bit of time with one of our reporters, and I guess since I've been in JAMA for like 27 years plus, that I've always made myself available to reporters because it gave, whether it was late on a Friday night or some other time, because it gave the opportunity to educate and set the facts right. And yet, I think that people need more education, because there have been publications, and everything that published isn't true as part of what the problem is, including that horrible headline. So, but the media, when it started talking about influencing, they can influence how others think. And so during the Texas, shooting and in the aftermath, spoke to a lot of reporters who were insisting and then would cite articles that had misfacts in them about how this is the case. And anyone who knows and wants to look at it, there's a huge volume of studies that were done many years ago. They started many years ago. There are others by a John Monahan. It was at University of Virginia or West Virginia. I was confused, Virginia, West Virginia, on violence and mental illness, and how that it's not an accurate portrayal. So I think checking our facts is important. All right, we have some questions here, not checking facts, but double checking them, I would say. Okay. Shauna also said she'll send the link to the recording to everyone who attended and registered. That was one question earlier. A question is, what are effective techniques for helping persons overcome feelings of stigma? So I guess, Karen, we're talking about the self-stigma, like that you feel stigmatized, or the person feels stigmatized.
Well, two things that I will mention. One is, I'm sorry. One is Patrick Corrigan at the University of Chicago has been working on the issue of self-stigma and how to overcome it for a long time now. He has a number of he has a book which and a center which has links to exercises and other recommendations for how one deals with self-stigma, number one. And so I would first of all refer people to Patrick Corrigan as the expert in this matter. Secondly, one of the things that has proven extremely valuable to people in coping with stigma is connection. Connection with other people who are going through the same experiences. There are a number of organizations of people with lived experience of mental illnesses who are helping themselves, including the National Empowerment Center in Boston, the Mental Health Consumer Self-Help Clearinghouse are the two ones that spring to mind most clearly, of people who are dealing with that, who can talk about that. But even if you don't contact those people, to echo some of what Maria's saying, in your local community, there are NAMI organizations, there are mental health consumer organizations, I'm sure, that if one contacts with, can find support and perspectives and strategies that would be helpful.
I will add to that, that in New Jersey, there is the collaborative support programs of New Jersey, as well as you say, like the NAMIs and the mental health associations, and they're the wellness centers too throughout the state, and other consumer run organizations, and they're very, very important. And I'm glad to say, when we look at where we were years ago and today, that the peer recovery movement and use of peers in the workforce, and promotion of peers as equals to equal but different, I guess, in terms of services delivered to the clinical staff has been growing and playing a very positive role.
Other panelists like to weigh in on this?
I can. I guess I want to say around self-stigma that one of the things that helped me to overcome my own stigma was remembering that that mental illness, the people in my life that are meant to be there are going to be there regardless of what my diagnosis is. And so it helped me to really realize that that I didn't have to worry too much, because some people would be in my life and they were my true friends, and then some people would drop off. And I learned to really accept that. And there's this saying, when it's dark out, you can see the stars. And I've really been fortunate to have some real stars in my life because they were willing to accept that about me. And it helped me to accept myself. So I think what Dr. Wall is saying about connection is super important to overcoming self-stigma.
And also with Attitudes in Reverse that I'm a board member of, and when I can go to the presentations at schools, I will. And we share our stories. So the organization was founded by a family who tragically lost their son to suicide, and they experienced a lot of stigma immediately after his death, which fueled their passion to educate, starting with the high school where their son attended, and growing throughout statewide and even other states. And when I was able to go to some of those presentations, so I also share my story when I'm there, and people thank all of us presenters for sharing that we struggled ourselves, or someone close to us, our loved ones had struggled. And just Trisha Baker, who co-founded Attitudes in Reverse, explains it as giving permission for people to speak up. And I see it more as encouragement, but I guess permission certainly works as well. And the more we're open, it helps us to eliminate that stigma within ourselves. As I mentioned earlier, I had it years ago when I was reluctant to go into therapy. Glad I did. And so it's all that education and that communication and that storytelling that really makes a huge, huge impact on the person talking and the people they're speaking with. And Deb, just so you know, I have a question that came into me directly rather than to everyone that we could get to at some point. So
okay, you'll jump
back.
Yeah, I'll leave it up to you. Jump back in. Thanks, Shauna.
Okay, sure.
Next question was, could we go over death by suicide versus committing suicide? I recognize Language Matters was saying died or death by suicide instead of commit suicide. And by the way, they don't use committing, or they use complete. I feel like the use of language with this should also be addressed. So someone want to take that?
Actually, that's the one I thought was sent just to me. So I'm glad it was shared with the whole group. That's one of the things Attitudes in Reverse and the John, where we're trying to emphasize that, yeah, when you say completed, it sounds like it's a project, like they meant to do that. And we certainly don't want to give that impression. And to say committed, it's implying that it's a sin or a crime, which it isn't. I mean, I think some cultures may see it that way, but we need to emphasize that suicide is I can't, even decision's not the right word, but it's a decision made by an unhealthy mind. And so I think you have to bring it back to that it's driven by an illness. It's a symptom of an illness. When I went through my suicide attempt myself, that's when I totally understood what my loved one who did die by suicide went through. And I explained it to my family members, especially some family members. Well, they don't do it anymore. They used to say snap out of it when I was depressed. And I explained to them, if I could, I would. I certainly don't choose to be depressed. It's the way my brain is wired, or miswired, or whatever the term might be. But so the more we say someone died by suicide or we lost someone to suicide, it takes that stigma away by not giving the impression that it was that person's fault. I mean, I've been in that situation myself. I have an amazing family, and my brain, in that really horrible state that it was in, would not let me stop thinking about I had to leave. I had to stop being a burden to everyone. And the only way to end my pain was to die. And miraculously, something broke through that tunnel vision. And then I decided to get help. So we need to be open and use the right terminology to encourage people. If they are having suicidal thoughts, they need to talk to someone about it to get them past that, and to get help and to help prevent it from happening again. So, and I think that language really it's just a huge factor.
I will note also that although some of the guides that I have mentioned do have guidelines for talking about and reporting about suicide, but there are also other guides, an increasing number, that are specifically directed at suicide and how to talk about it and how to report about it.
Can I just add that, suicide is tricky because when I started reporting, there was a very clear sense that talking about it caused it. It was almost like, we can't have sex education because kids will get this idea that they're going to have, they should have sex and that they're going to go home and have sex right away. I mean, it was and it was sort of this circular argument, like, okay, well, if we can't talk about it, how can we talk about it? How can we address it? What can we do? And I'm guessing we're past that now, because I haven't run into that in a long, long time, but it was very much a factor at one point.
Hi, my name is Rose. I'm a nurse practitioner, and I see some comments on the chat about the vaccine and mental health. I do want to share that I connected with NAMI when my son was diagnosed with mental health, and I learned so much about how words matter, and that he is a young man living with schizoaffective disorder, and how to just know signs and symptoms. But what I wanted to share is that it impacted the whole family, friends and family, and some of us sought help. In addition, I feel that awareness, education, and accountability are also important, because, we're talking about the title of that article with the residents or the attendants who had mental illness. And okay, fine, a mistake was made, but it should never happen again. I mean, it's highly insensitive. It actually almost brought tears to my eyes, because I love my son, and how people speak of him and treat him are critical. And when we had a family crisis and I called for help, there were like 10 police officers who almost knocked down my door to help us. But I was screaming because he was a young man of color, and I wanted to make sure that the situation was handled well. And they did an extremely amazing job, and my son is fine. But what I wanted to really share in this moment is that I'm a healthcare worker. COVID vaccine, the virus does not cause mental illness. There are so many healthcare workers who are suffering from mental, health issues, because as our community, we've dealt with isolation, losses and grief, and that's why our behaviors are relatable to mental health issues. So it's not the virus specifically, or not the vaccine. So in terms of education, that's important. But I've learned so much about my role as a mother, how to advocate for my family, my community, and for Latinx community and people of color. But I've also learned that as a healthcare worker, it's my job when a patient comes to the hospital with mental illness or any behavior that's in question, it is my responsibility to be thoughtful, sensitive, and compassionate, because that could be you, that could be your loved one, that could be anyone. So I just felt it was important to share my story and to speak up about COVID and family members living with someone who lives with disorders.
Thank you. We're going to go to the next question, I think, unless anybody has a response or to that comment. So thank you for that and for that educational piece about COVID, of course, not causing mental illness. Although I will say, and I did that, interestingly, people who do have mental illnesses and specifically schizophrenia who did get COVID had much more serious risk and outcomes. So, you know, that comes to mind. We have another question here from Merrill. Recently, I saw a news report about a public health worker being killed, and it was stated that the person was killed by someone who has schizophrenia. How should that story have been reported? What is the right way?
Well, I'm not sure
Sorry.
that
Yeah, I was on mute.
Go ahead.
Merle, the thing that I always see missing from a story like that is accurate information about the number of people who hear voices telling them to do something violent, which is a very, very, very small percentage of people who hear, extremely small percentage of people who hear direct voices instructing them and badgering them and telling them to do a violent act. In other words, it's an opportunity to teach what schizophrenia is. It's a scary word in the first place, but the definition, the clinical definition is, you know, you can have multisensory psychosis. Hearing is only one of them, and hearing a voice telling you to kill, to you know, create a bomb, those yeah, they happen, it happens, but nowhere near as much as people think. And then when it's not, when that paragraph doesn't end up in the story, we just miss that opportunity to educate about an extremely serious illness. And that's really how I would have wanted that story improved.
Can I just add to that? I would argue that while it is always, it is not always the time and place to educate everybody about the disease that is mentioned. You know, in that particular story, it may have been it may have looked or read out of place. But I would argue that as a reporter, we have that responsibility to ask ourselves, why does schizophrenia matter in this sentence? Why am I including this? And then to ask the person that's presenting you this information, usually police or whatever, what else do we know about this individual? That is one characteristic. They have no way of knowing. I mean, we could ask, is that what caused the person to do this violent thing? They don't know that, right? But what else do we know about this person? Let's put this person in a bigger context, because I think that, Marie, you're right. Once we hear that word, people, that's what they focus on, the scariness of the potential danger. I feel like the reporters and the editors and everybody involved in the story have to sort of back up and say, why are we putting that word in there? What else do we know about the person? How does it all add up? Again, what does that stew make at the end when we put all these words together? And it may not be relevant. It's going to be really hard to not put it in there, but maybe there are other things we know about the person that could also add to it. You know, maybe the person was homeless. Maybe the person had, other chronic health issues, I mean, you can go on, didn't have a job, didn't have, was isolated. I mean, there are many things that may drive people to violence, and they're not all mental health diagnoses, as we know. So I just think we have to think more broadly and not, as reporters and editors, not get tricked into those loaded words and connecting them to actions before we know.
Thank you.
I think this is also an instance of a word conjuring up a whole picture that may or may not relate. Schizophrenia is a complicated disorder that has many, many varied manifestations. And to throw it out there as if it's a meaningful thing to say about a person tells you very little about what that person has actually experienced, how long they've had that, how severe it is, how much recovery has been, how much treatment there has or has not been for that disorder. And we use the term just in some ways because it encapsulates it. We were talking about the scarcity of words, the use of words as a kind of a shorthand. Well, here's a word that conjures up fearfulness in people. So when we toss it out there, it conjures up a whole picture of what this person is like that may or may not be true, even though they do have a disorder called schizophrenia, number one. Number two, it's an example of what I was referring to as throwing out a diagnosis as an explanation for the behavior. As you were pointing out, there are many, many things that may have contributed to that outcome. Mental illness may be part of it, and may not be, but there may also be many other things. But simply offering the diagnosis as an explanation really is not very informative. Even if we were to say, look, that person had schizophrenia yesterday, they didn't do it yesterday, they didn't do it the month before, what's going on that helps to explain that action?
So, and those were all very good. And as you say, we have a lot of work. The most stigmatized, I think, of the mental illnesses is definitely schizophrenia, because, and it's still the most misunderstood, as I think I mentioned in, some of my opening remarks. There are two questions. I'll sort of answer. The first one, is there a list of mental health reporters? They're the members of the Associated Press, but and they're not all necessarily mental health reporters. Usually organizations or individuals over time, I don't know of, and please jump in, and Lilo in particular, you might know if there is a place where they have here all the mental health reporters. Usually we compile them ourselves. Also, it's complicated because there's different form of media, everything from TV to radio to statewide or national newspapers, as well as trade publications. There's social media. People come and go too in the field. They also get reassigned very frequently. And the field has been evolving a lot, especially since the pandemic and the move to online. So the short answer is no. It's like usually you compile it yourself if you have something that you want to reach out to, and we can share. And usually they tend to be proprietary to most organizations, because that's their context for stories. But we could certainly help you out if you have something you want to get out there. You can, send it, and if it seems appropriate, I'll help. Another really good question here from Reverend Ibar is, how do you approach someone with visible mental issues, like talking to themselves, to offer help or assistance? So that, of course, is probably a question that would go more to a clinician. I think we have some on the line versus a, journalist. If not, we can answer it more generally. But I did see earlier members of our clinical staff,
I think that it can also be answered by a person with lived experience, because we've really lived it. So I guess what I want to say is approach them with compassion. I remember at different times in my experience when I was experiencing psychosis and my behavior was unusual, that I had two kind of certain reactions by people that knew me, etc. I had some roommates, for example, who would shout "Jeepers Creepers" every time I walked into the room. And I heard that, I heard that kind of thing. And so even though someone may look like they are, their eyes are glazed over and maybe they look like they're not functioning in the way that others may function, we hear it and we know. And so I think just approaching someone and understanding that they are going through a very difficult experience and that they have an illness, and if you were approaching someone with cancer, you wouldn't be disparaging them for the fact that they have an illness. Mental illness is one of the only illnesses where we blame it on the person who has it, and we blame the behavior on the person who has it. And so I just think being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes is really important.
I'd also like to mention the answer for Reverend Ibar. I put it in the chat, but I want to mention mental health first aid. It was started on the national level, and it is now administered sort of promoted by the National Council for Wellbeing. It is a national effort to answer your question directly. It's a training program, but also a train the trainer program where if you go to a training, you can either choose to just take the training on exactly what you're talking about. How do we treat people in the same way? If you saw somebody having a cardiac arrest, we know CPR. Mental health first aid is exactly that. And I have to say, I don't know what area of the state you're in, but we have, I think we have over 21,000 people trained to provide that training throughout the state. I did a story on that. I think it was published in August in Hopewell Valley News as a very, very important part of the connection and the kindness that we're all talking about, getting educated to answer that question. Thank you for asking it.
I will also say, as a clinician who trains other clinicians, that you should use what has always been a rule of thumb: listen first. Otherwise, you become a person who's approaching someone and saying, I think your behavior is abnormal or aberrant, and I think it needs to be fixed. What you want to do is to engage the person, talk to them, listen to them. Why are they talking to themselves over there in the corner? What are they saying? What is their experience right now? And then once you have engaged them, once you have shown that you're interested in them or their lives, it's much easier to be able to talk to them about what they might do. It's very likely that you will find that some part of that is distressing and that the person themselves wants to be able to do something about it, but you can't engage that until they themselves feel that you understand and are willing to accept them.
Thank you. That was great questions and really good answers. So appreciate that. Another question is, do you all still share the stigma-free kits with municipalities? I think you might be talking about the New Jersey Institute for Healthcare Quality that has a project that they work with municipalities and with mayors and mental health first aid. So there may be a kit that I assume that's going with it. I think that there may be. So, Shauna, I don't know if you have their, somebody's maybe Julie DeSimone's contact there. She heads that program, I think, that you can put in the chat.
You're referring to the stigma-free zones?
Yeah, well, it says stigma-free kits with municipalities. So
okay.
I know that they, among others, so if that's what the person's answering, there are also stigma-free zones, and it's an upcoming project or one that is being talked about and will be launched over the, next year of the Governor's Council on Mental Health. Stigma is doing a playbook for becoming a mental health stigma-free zone. But I think this is stigma-free kits, and I know that there is a project, as I said, with me.
I'll have to look into that and I'll send it along with the link to the recording to everybody.
Okay,
I'm not familiar off the top of my head where to get my hands on it, so.
okay.
I'll
It is,
definitely
it's two different resources.
Okay.
Stigma, as you know, stigma-free zone has been around for about 10 years. People may have seen those signs around their own neighborhoods and wanted to do it in their own neighborhoods.
Right, and then the stigma-free kits, I think, were being
Yeah.
given out by the New Jersey Healthcare
Yeah.
Quality Institute.
The
So
Quality
Shauna,
Institute.
thank you. She can send, I don't know that you can send the kit, but you can send the link to where they can get the kit if you can't otherwise. So thank you. So someone is asking, and I don't know if this is a rhetorical question. I guess HIPAA doesn't apply to the media. So I'll let the media take that one.
Sorry, I tried to answer that in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
No, that's okay. HIPAA, it's a great question because I was thinking the same thing as we were talking about it. Like, how did they know this? So HIPAA applies to the releasing of information. It is, you violate HIPAA by sharing the information. So if the doctor released and said, you know, this individual who's now arrested was schizophrenic, or if the police department releases it, they're violating HIPAA. The media isn't violating HIPAA by repeating that information, just as you wouldn't be violating it if you were sharing it on, you know, in a text message to a friend. You're not violating, you're just sharing information that was possibly released improperly. But the bigger question is absolutely, why are we getting this piecemeal diagnosis information? And where is HIPAA in all this? I think it's a great question. I mean, and it's usually at press conferences held by, you know, public safety organizations, if we're talking about, you know, a violent incident, and they usually release information. And it's a great question why they would feel able to release that and not be violating HIPAA. I mean, they shouldn't even know it, to be frank. I'm not clear. There's definitely a violation somewhere. It's just the problem isn't with the media. We've got our other set of problems, but we're not violating HIPAA in that case. We're doing other bad things. But it's a great question. I mean, where's the privacy? It's supposed to protect privacy. Where's the privacy of the individual who may be accused of a violent crime or may not be, you know, having their medical information shared? It's a great question.
So the rest of the chat has comments, and in our just remaining few minutes, I'd like to make a few closing remarks. So first of all, I'm most grateful to all of you for investing your valuable time to learning about the impact that media has and how that influence can be positive regarding stigma. I want to warmly thank, you know, our keynoter, Dr. Otto Wall, and our panelists, Valerie Kennedy and Grossman, Shauna Moses, Lilo Stainton, and Marie Verna. And I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts. Only through proper education can we begin to remove the social stigma that's connected to those with disabilities, said Robert Hensel, who was born with spina bifida and holds the world record for the longest nonstop wheelie in a wheelchair. And although his disability is physical, his statement applies to stigma against individuals with all types of disabilities, including mental illnesses and co-occurring disorders. Another contemporary, Paul Watson, a Canadian-American environmental activist, summed up the message of today's event when he said, "We live in a media culture, and whoever controls and influences and uses media the best has the power for change." Elimination of stigma is an extremely important change to make, and it can happen, especially with best practices followed by news reporters, editors, anchors, and producers, as well as on social media in everyone's daily conversations. So again, I want to express my extreme gratitude to all of you today for advancing that conversation and pushing us forward in eliminating stigma and in creating greater understanding and appreciation for those who do have mental illnesses, and for the correct way to respectfully and accurately portray them in any media story, and to portray the illnesses correctly. So I hope that this gives everyone a lot of food for thought. And again, I thank you for joining me and the Governor's Council on Mental Health Stigma in this ongoing mission. And, you know, we are committed to continuing until all stigma and discrimination are eliminated. So thank you and have a wonderful day. And thank you for sharing.